Module 14, the respiratory system, anatomy and functions of the respiratory system. Before we go into the physiology of the respiratory system, it's important that you first understand its anatomy, so we can use the correct terminology and you know all the body's parts that are involved in this system. First, the respiratory system can be divided into two major parts. The upper respiratory tract is the part of the respiratory system containing the nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, and pharynx. So this is the area of the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract is the part of the respiratory system containing the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So this is the area of the lower respiratory tract. Now take a look at the bronchi here. They divide up into smaller and smaller tubes, eventually becoming so small that they become microscopic. At the ends of these tubes are the tiny alveoli. As we go over the parts of the system, you will see that each part has a specific function, or groups of functions. Beginning with the location that we take in air, the nasal cavity has two major jobs. Its first function is to provide olfaction. Remember that this has to do with the sense of smell. As you take in air, certain chemicals that are floating in that air can reach the olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity. Thus, olfaction is involved in the nervous system as well as the respiratory system. The second function of the nasal cavity has to do with altering the air that is inhaled. You see, the nasal cavity has lots of surface area which is filled with vascular tissue. That means there are a lot of blood vessels located there. Well, the blood flowing through those vessels is warm. Additionally, the lining of the nasal cavity is covered with a mucous membrane that's moist and sticky. So when you take in air, or inhale, that air becomes warmed as it passes by the blood vessels. It is also moistened by the mucus of the mucous membranes. And thirdly, any bits of foreign material in that air become stuck on the mucous membrane. So the air is warmed, moistened, and cleaned before it goes any further into the body. And this is an important function because eventually that air makes it to the delicate alveoli, which are made of simple squamous epithelium. If the air wasn't conditioned, it could damage that tissue. If you've ever been outside when it's very cold and breathed through your mouth for a while, you can feel a slight burning feeling in your chest. That's because the air is bothering the tissue of the lungs because it's very cold and not cleaned as well as if it went in through the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, air then enters the pharynx. This is the area through which both food and air travel. The upper part of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx, and the lower part is the oropharynx. At the end of the nasopharynx is the uvula, a small extension of tissue that hangs down from the soft palate. It's helpful because it provides extra tissue to better close off the nasal cavity during deglutition, or swallowing. In the nasopharynx, there are also two openings for the eustachian tubes. These tubes provide passage of air from each middle ear to the pharynx. That enables you to equalize the pressure between the middle ear and the outside atmospheric pressure. You may have felt this change if you've ever driven in high mountains or flown in an airplane. There was less air at the higher altitudes, so the air pressure pushing on the outside of the eardrum was decreased. But the air pushing on the other side of the eardrum in the middle ear had the original pressure from lower altitudes, so it feels uncomfortable. If you swallow or chew gum, you can cause the eustachian tubes to open a bit into the pharynx, allowing air to move out of the middle ear and equalize that pressure. The oropharynx is inferior to the nasopharynx, and it covers the area from the uvula to the epiglottis. This is where the oral opening to the pharynx is located, so food and air travel through the oropharynx. The oropharynx also contains two pairs of tonsils. Posterior to the larynx is the laryngopharynx. As long as you're not swallowing, air moves through the laryngopharynx on its way to the larynx. But during deglutition, the epiglottis blocks the larynx and food moves from the laryngopharynx to the esophagus. Now the respiratory system has some major functions. The first is ventilation. It's the more life-essential of the functions. Ventilation is the process of getting air into the lungs and back out. The second function besides ventilation is voice. In fact, the common name for the larynx is the voice box. It has vocal cords that help you to make controlled sounds for speaking and singing. After air passes through the larynx, it enters the trachea or windpipe. This tube-shaped part of the respiratory system is made up of about 20 C-shaped pieces of cartilage that are held together by dense, regular connective tissue and smooth muscle. The trachea divides into two routes for air to travel. These are called bronchi. Each bronchus carries air to a single lung. and the air is pretty much evenly divided between the two routes, but not exactly equally. A bit more than half of the air you inhale moves through the shorter right primary bronchus and into the right lung, and a bit less than half of the air moves through the slightly longer and slightly narrower left primary bronchus on its way to the left lung. And not only are the two bronchi a bit different from one another, each lung is a bit different too. The lungs are made up of lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung has 2. Now, this isn't just a random design. You see, your heart is located right here, a bit to the left of the center line of the body, so it takes up a bit more space on the left side than the right side. Thus, your left lung is a little smaller because your heart takes up some of the available space. Following the pathway of air I've been introducing, each bronchus divides into smaller tubes, which are called secondary bronchi. And each secondary bronchus serves a single lobe of the lung. The right lung then has 3 secondary bronchi, and the left lung has 2. As I mentioned earlier, the tubes in the lungs then continue to branch, splitting into smaller and smaller tubes called tertiary bronchi. These bronchi then further divide up, forming bronchioles. The bronchioles branch again and eventually form terminal bronchioles. At this point, the branching continues, forming alveolar ducts that then open up into the microscopic sacs called alveoli. They get this name because alveoli means hollow cavity, and these structures are basically hollow sacs lined with simple squamous epithelium. The tissue of the alveoli is lined with capillaries for gas exchange. This is the third function of the respiratory system. It's called respiration, and respiration, being a vital function, involves 3 major steps. The first is external respiration. External respiration is the process of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the alveoli and the blood. You see, when you take in a breath of air, the oxygen in that air diffuses into the blood within the capillaries of the alveoli. It then can travel to the cells of the body. At the same time, carbon dioxide gas that is in the blood can diffuse out of the capillaries and into the alveoli so it can be exhaled. So after external respiration, the second part of respiration is called gas transport in the blood. And it should make sense to you because we've already gone over the cardiovascular system. Remember that blood in the lungs picks up oxygen and then moves to the left heart where it's pumped to the tissue of the body. It then can supply the cells with the necessary oxygen. Then the blood picks up carbon dioxide from those cells, which is then transported back to the lungs to be exhaled. The last stage of respiration is called internal respiration. Internal respiration is the process of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the cells and the blood. Now, this is different from the other 2 stages. This stage happens in all the cells all over the body, as opposed to external respiration, which occurs in the lungs and the gases are exchanged from the air to the blood and the blood to the air. Internal respiration happens because the body's cells burn nutrients so they can make ATP for energy. This process, called cellular respiration, requires oxygen, and a product of that ATP production is carbon dioxide, so it has to be eliminated as a waste. So internal respiration is the gas exchange that happens at the cells.